May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The Allies celebrated in the streets of London, Paris, and New York. Soldiers kissed nurses. Champagne bottles popped. Church bells rang across the Western world. But in Germany, there was no celebration, only silence and hunger. Here is a number that will haunt you. Between April and July 1945, more Germans died from starvation than from combat in the final year of the war. 12 million displaced, 800 calories per day, bodies in the streets that no one had strength to bury. And somewhere in that apocalypse, a wheat farmer from Oklahoma looked at a dying German woman and made a choice that broke every rule in the military handbook. His name was William James Barker, 31 years old, Sergeant 69th Infantry Division. He had killed Germans for 11 months straight across France, Belgium, and the Rhine. Her name was Margaret Fisher, 23 years old, former schoolteacher. She weighed 78 pounds and had not eaten a real meal in 3 weeks. He gave her a chocolate bar. She gave him her life. This is their story. And I promise you, by the end you will understand why 3 words changed everything. You're mine now. Let me take you back to understand how Germany reached this point. September 1st, 1939. Hitler invaded Poland. World War II began. For the next 5 years, Germany conquered, occupied, and terrorized most of Europe. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. German civilians believed victory was certain. Then came 1943. Stalingrad fell. 300,000 German soldiers dead, wounded, or captured in a single battle. The tide turned. Allied bombers began systematic destruction of German cities. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, Berlin. Night after night, fire rained from the sky. By January 1945, the war was lost. Everyone knew it, except Hitler. Soviet forces pushed from the east. American and British forces pushed from the west. Caught between 2 grinding armies were 60 million German civilians who had nowhere to run. The infrastructure collapsed first. Railways destroyed, bridges bombed, factories burning. Then the food system failed. Farms became battlefields. Distribution networks ceased to exist. Ration cards became worthless paper. April 1945. The final month. German soldiers surrendered by the hundreds of thousands. Hitler shot himself in a bunker on April 30th. The government disintegrated. And in the chaos, ordinary Germans faced a new enemy more ruthless than any army. Starvation. The town of Torgau sat 40 miles northeast of Leipzig on the banks of the Elbe River. Before the war, 3,000 people lived there. Bakers, teachers, farmers, shopkeepers. The kind of place where nothing ever happened. By April 1945, Torgau was rubble and ghosts. Margaret Fisher had watched her world collapse piece by piece. First, her brother Klaus, conscripted in 1943, killed at Stalingrad. The family never received his body, never had a grave to visit. Her mother stopped sleeping after that. Her father stopped talking. Then the Wehrmacht requisitioned their bakery in 1944. 30 years of family business gone overnight. Soldiers needed bread more than civilians. February 1945. Allied bombers hit Torgau. Margaret was in the cellar with her parents when the explosion started. The building shook. Dust fell. Her father clutched his chest, gasped twice, and died. Heart attack. He was 54 years old. Her mother survived the bombing, but not the grief. She stopped eating in March, simply refused food. Margaret begged, pleaded, threatened. Nothing worked. Her mother faded like morning fog until one morning she did not wake up. Margaret buried both parents in the garden. She dug the graves herself because there was no one left to help. April 25, 1945. Her mother's birthday. Margaret remembered that detail because the Americans chose that day to arrive. Jeeps rolled through streets lined with broken buildings. Soldiers set up checkpoints. The occupation began. Margaret hid in the bakery cellar for 3 days. Not from fear of violence, from exhaustion. She had nothing left. No family, no home, no food, no reason to climb those stairs. She survived on rainwater and 3 potatoes buried in ash. On the 4th day, hunger forced her up. The sunlight blinded her. The square was unrecognizable. American trucks everywhere. Soldiers moving with purpose. The sound of English sharp and foreign filling the air she had known her entire life. She did not expect help. German propaganda had spent years describing Americans as savages. Liberation meant chaos. Freedom meant starvation. She expected nothing from these conquering soldiers except to be ignored. So she went back to the only thing she knew. The ruins of her family's bakery. She knelt in the rubble and began sifting through dust, searching for any grain that might have survived. It was not logical. It was ritual, the last connection to everything she had lost. William Barker had landed at Utah Beach on June 6, 1944. 11 months of combat. France, Belgium, the Ardennes, the Rhine crossing. He had seen things no Oklahoma farm boy should ever see. He had done things that would wake him in the night for decades. He had watched friends die. He had killed enemies. He had walked through concentration camps and seen horrors that broke something inside him permanently. By April 1945, William was tired in ways sleep could not fix. The war was ending, but he felt nothing. No joy. No relief. Just numbness. He went through the motions of occupation duty because orders required it. Then he saw her. A woman kneeling in rubble, digging with bare hands. Not frantically. Methodically, like she had done this 1,000 times before. Her dress hung on her like fabric on wire. Her hair was brittle and gray. She looked 60 years old. She was 23. William watched her for a full minute. Something about her movements reached through his numbness. She was not begging. She was not crying. She was working, searching, fighting to survive in the only way left to her. He walked over. "What are you looking for?" She looked up, pale blue eyes in a skeletal face. She did not understand his words but understood his tone. She held up a handful of dust and grain, showed it to him. Let it fall through her fingers. William grew up during the Dust Bowl, Oklahoma 1930s. He had watched his family nearly starve. He had seen neighbors lose everything to drought and depression. His mother had fed hobos from their back door, even when they barely had enough for themselves. He knew hunger, real hunger, the kind that turns people into ghosts. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a D-ration chocolate bar. 4 ounces. Soldiers complained it tasted like cardboard. He held it out to her. Margaret stared at the chocolate. She did not move. This was a trick. It had to be. Why would an enemy soldier give her food? What did he want in return? William understood her hesitation. He had seen it in the concentration camps, in the refugee columns, in the eyes of people who had been betrayed so completely that kindness itself became suspicious. He knelt beside her, unwrapped the chocolate, broke off a piece, and ate it himself. "See safe." He held out the rest. Her hand moved before her mind could stop it. She took the chocolate. It felt heavy, substantial, real. She brought it to her mouth. The first taste made her eyes close. Sweetness flooding a body that had forgotten sweetness existed. Her hands shook. Her eyes burned. She forced herself to chew slowly, but her body screamed for more. William gave her 2 more ration bars. Everything he had. Then he walked away. That night, he could not sleep. He kept seeing those pale blue eyes, that skeletal face, the way she had held the dust and grain like it was precious. Corporal Danny Reeves. His friend from Brooklyn asked what was wrong. "I met a woman today, German civilian. She's starving to death." "They're all starving. You can't save them all." "I know." But William could not let go. Something in that woman refused to leave his mind. Not pity. Something else. Respect. She had been kneeling in rubble with dignity. Working, not begging. Surviving, not surrendering. He went back the next morning. She was there. Same spot. Same methodical searching. He brought more food. This time she took it without hesitation. Day after day, William returned. He found a German interpreter named Herr Schmidt. Through him, he learned her story. Margaret, teacher, family dead, completely alone. He started bringing real food. Bread from the mess hall, eggs, soup in a thermos. Each item was stolen technically. Sharing military rations with enemy nationals violated regulations. If caught, he faced court-martial. He did not care. Margaret gained weight slowly. Color returned to her face. She began learning English phrases. Simple words at first. Hello. Thank you. Good morning. Her mind, starved for months, awakened alongside her body. The third week of May, she asked him a question in halting English. Why? Why you help me? William thought about his mother, about her kitchen during the Depression, about strangers she fed when they had almost nothing themselves, about the philosophy she lived by even when his father complained about wasting food. Because you needed help. Margaret did not respond. She did not know how to respond. For years, she had lived in a country that worshipped strength and despised weakness. Compassion was suspicious. Kindness was manipulation. Help always came with a price. This American wanted nothing from her. He simply gave. It broke something inside her. Something hard and protective that had formed during years of war and loss. She cried that night for the first time since her mother died, not from sadness, from relief. June arrived. William's unit received orders, shipping out to France, possibly the Pacific after that. The war with Japan continued. He had 3 weeks left in Torgau. He spent every free hour with Margaret. Their relationship had no name, not friendship, not romance, something that existed outside normal categories. Two people who had found each other in the ruins of civilization. June 15th, evening. William found Margaret sitting on what had been the front step of the bakery. Tears on her face. Not crying, just tears. Years of grief finally releasing. He sat beside her, did not speak, did not need to. When you leave, she said in slow English, I will have nothing again. The words hit him like artillery. He had been avoiding this. The leaving, the abandoning. He had saved her from starvation, only to leave her alone in a destroyed country, with no family, no home, no future. Come with me, he said. She did not understand. To America, when I leave, come with me. Impossible, insane, against every regulation. Enemy nationals could not simply immigrate. The paperwork alone would take months. Marriage was required. Background checks. Investigations. Margaret stared at him. How? I don't know, but I will find a way. He proposed on June 20th. No ring, no speech, just words. Margaret, will you marry me and come to Oklahoma? She said yes before he finished asking. The wedding was June 27th. A small church outside Torgau. Military chaplain Robert Morrison officiating. Margaret wore a Red Cross dress. William wore his uniform. The witnesses were Corporal Danny Reeves and Herr Schmidt. After the ceremony, William took both her hands. You're mine now. The interpreter translated. In German, the words meant something different. Protective, belonging, family. Du gehörst jetzt zu mir. Margaret understood perfectly. She was his responsibility now, and he was hers. In a world that had collapsed completely, they were building something new together. But here is what they did not know. The paperwork would take 9 months. Margaret would stay in Germany alone through a brutal winter. She would face interrogations about her family's politics, suspicions about Nazi connections, forms lost, resubmitted, lost again. William would ship out in July. His letters would take weeks to arrive. Margaret would read them by candlelight, memorizing every word, holding on to hope. And when she finally reached Oklahoma in March 1946, she would face hatred she never expected. The woman at the feed store calling her Nazi. Neighbors whispering. Doors closing. William had saved her body. But could he save her from a country that still saw her as the enemy? In Part 2, we will see Margaret's 9-month wait in destroyed Germany. The brutal investigation of her family. The letters that kept her alive. And the moment she finally saw the Statue of Liberty through morning fog. The war was over, but her real battle had just begun. July 1945. William Barker shipped out of Torgau on a military convoy headed for France. Margaret stood on the roadside watching the trucks disappear into dust and distance. She had 90 seconds to say goodbye. 90 seconds after everything they had survived together. She wore the same dress from their wedding. Her hand stayed raised long after the convoy vanished. She did not cry. She had no tears left. In Part 1, you watched a starving German woman receive chocolate from an American soldier. You watched that simple act of kindness become something more. You watched William Barker break every military regulation to save Margaret Fisher. You watched them marry in a bombed church while the world collapsed around them. But marriage was only the beginning. Here is a number that will shock you. Between 1945 and 1950, over 100,000 American soldiers married foreign women during occupation duty. Only 40% of those women ever reached American soil. The rest were denied visas, abandoned, or trapped in bureaucratic nightmares that lasted years. Margaret Fisher Barker was about to enter that nightmare. And this is where everything got worse. July 15, 1945. 2 weeks after William left. Margaret reported to the American Military Government Office in Torgau to begin her immigration paperwork. She expected forms. She expected waiting. She did not expect interrogation. The officer behind the desk was Captain Harold Morrison. 42 years old, career military. He had lost a brother at Normandy and made no effort to hide his contempt for German civilians. "You married Sergeant Barker," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "How long did you know him before the marriage?" 2 months. Captain Morrison wrote something in his file. His pen moved slowly, deliberately. 2 months. And before that, you were a German national living under the Nazi regime. I was a schoolteacher. Were you a member of the Nazi Party? No. Was your father? Margaret hesitated. That hesitation would cost her 3 months. Her father had been a baker, a simple man who wanted nothing except to run his shop and raise his family. But in Nazi Germany, simple men made complicated choices. The local business guild required membership fees. Those fees went to the party. Her father paid them because refusal meant losing his license. He had attended 2 meetings. He had never worn a uniform. He had never raised his arm in salute, except when soldiers were watching. He was not a Nazi. He was a survivor. But on paper, compliance and enthusiasm looked identical. Your file indicates your father paid dues to the Nazi Party from 1938 to 1944, Captain Morrison said. He was a baker. He had no choice. Everyone had a choice, Mrs. Barker. The investigation began that day. Margaret was interviewed 4 times over the following week. Each interview lasted hours. The questions repeated endlessly. Where did your father get his flour? Who were his customers? Did Wehrmacht officers eat at your bakery? Did your brother volunteer for the army, or was he conscripted? She answered truthfully. She had nothing to hide. But truth did not matter. Suspicion mattered, and every German civilian was suspicious until proven otherwise. August 1945. The war with Japan ended. Atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Soldiers began shipping home by the millions. William wrote to Margaret that he expected discharge by October. He would return to Oklahoma. He would prepare the farm. He would send for her as soon as her visa cleared. His letters took 3 weeks to arrive. Margaret read them by candlelight in the boarding house where she lived. She memorized every word. She kept them in a tin box under her bed next to the photographs he had sent of Oklahoma. She wrote back every week. Long letters describing her days, her progress with the paperwork, her hope. She did not tell him about the interrogations. She did not tell him about Captain Morrison. She did not want him to worry. September 1945. Margaret's background investigation expanded. American intelligence officers interviewed her former neighbors, her former students, anyone who might remember something incriminating. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. But finding nothing was not the same as clearing her file. October 1945. William received his honorable discharge and returned to Oklahoma. He immediately began writing letters to every official he could think of. His congressman, his senator, the War Department, the State Department. He demanded updates on his wife's visa status. The responses were identical. Processing. Under review. Please be patient. November 1945. Winter arrived in Germany with brutal force. Fuel was scarce. Food remained rationed. The boarding house where Margaret lived had no heat. She wore every piece of clothing she owned to bed and still woke shivering. She got a job with the American Occupation Administration as a translator and clerk. The work was tedious, but essential. It kept her fed. More importantly, it gave her access to information. She learned that her file had been flagged for additional review. She learned that Captain Morrison had recommended denial of her visa application. She learned that without intervention, she would never see America. December 1945. Margaret made a decision that terrified her. She requested a meeting with Colonel Thomas Wright, the senior American officer overseeing civilian immigration in the region. Colonel Wright had a reputation for fairness. He also had a reputation for refusing meetings with German civilians. She waited outside his office for 6 hours. When his aide finally admitted her, she had rehearsed her speech so many times she could deliver it in her sleep. Colonel Wright, my name is Margaret Barker. I am married to Sergeant William Barker of Tulsa, Oklahoma. My visa application has been under review for 5 months. I am requesting your help. Colonel Wright was 53 years old. He had served in the First World War. He had watched Germany rise and fall twice in his lifetime. He had no particular sympathy for German civilians. But he listened. Margaret told him everything. Her father, the baker. Her brother, who died at Stalingrad. Her parents, who died in the bombing and its aftermath. The American soldier who gave her chocolate when she was starving. The wedding in the damaged church. The husband waiting in Oklahoma. She did not cry. She did not beg. She spoke with the same dignity William had first seen in her when she knelt in the rubble searching for grain. When she finished, Colonel Wright was silent for a long moment. Your file says your father paid Nazi Party dues. My father was a baker, sir. He wanted to bake bread. He paid whatever fees were required to keep his license. He never believed in their ideology. He never harmed anyone. Many Germans say similar things now. Many Germans are lying. I am not. Colonel Wright studied her face. Why should I believe you? Because I am still here, sir. If I were lying, if I had something to hide, I would have fled. I would have disappeared into the refugee columns heading west. Instead, I stayed. I submitted to your investigations. I answered every question. I have nothing to fear from the truth. Colonel Wright made a note in his file. I will review your case personally. Margaret left his office not knowing if she had succeeded or failed. She returned to the boarding house and wrote to William. For the first time, she told him about the investigations, about Captain Morrison, about Colonel Wright. His response arrived 3 weeks later. It contained one sentence that made her cry. I am coming to get you. January 1946. William Barker, recently discharged sergeant, applied for emergency travel documents to return to Germany. His request was denied. Civilians could not enter occupation zones without military authorization. He applied again. Denied again. He drove to Washington, D.C., and showed up at the War Department in person. He waited in lobbies. He filled out forms. He demanded meetings with officials who refused to see him. Nothing worked. February 1946, 9 months after their wedding. Margaret received a letter from Colonel Wright's office. Her visa application had been approved. Her background investigation was complete. No evidence of Nazi affiliation had been found. She could immigrate to the United States. Margaret read the letter 3 times. Then she sat on her bed in the freezing boarding house and sobbed. Not delicate tears. Deep shaking release. 9 months of fear, uncertainty, and loneliness finally ending. She sent a telegram to William. 2 words. Approved. Coming. His response arrived the next day. 1 word. Finally. March 1946. The journey began. Margaret traveled by train from Torgau to Bremerhaven. The trains were crowded with refugees, displaced persons, soldiers returning home. She sat on her suitcase in the corridor for 18 hours because there were no seats. At Bremerhaven, she boarded a military transport ship bound for New York. The crossing took 12 days. She was seasick for 10 of them. She shared a cabin with 3 other war brides, women from France, Belgium, and England, who had married American soldiers. They talked through the long nights at sea. They shared their fears about America. Would they be accepted? Would they fit in? Would their husbands still love them after months apart? March 15, 1946. The ship entered New York Harbor at dawn. Margaret stood on deck, wrapped in a borrowed coat, watching the shoreline emerge from morning fog. Then she saw it. The Statue of Liberty. She had seen photographs. She had read about it in books. But nothing prepared her for the reality. The statue rose from the water like a promise, like hope made solid, like everything she had survived to reach. The French war bride beside her was crying. The Belgian woman was laughing. The English woman was silent, staring. Margaret felt all 3 emotions simultaneously. She was in America. She had made it. Ellis Island processed her efficiently. Stamps on documents. Questions answered. Medical examination passed. By noon, she was officially a legal permanent resident of the United States. The train from New York to Tulsa took 3 days. Margaret watched America scroll past the windows. Cities gave way to farmland. Farmland gave way to plains. Everything was bigger than she had imagined. The sky stretched wider than any sky in Germany. The fields went on forever. March 18, 1946. Tulsa train station. 3:47 p.m. Margaret stepped off the train carrying 1 suitcase containing everything she owned. The platform was crowded. She scanned the faces searching for William. Then she saw him. He looked different. Civilian clothes instead of uniform. Thinner. Older. But when their eyes met, his face transformed. The exhaustion disappeared. He smiled like a man reborn. He crossed the platform in 4 strides and pulled her into his arms. "You made it," he whispered. "You actually made it. I promised I would wait. I promised I would stay strong." They stood there for a long time holding each other while travelers streamed past. 9 months of separation. 9 months of letters and fear and loneliness. Finally over. The drive to the farm took an hour. Red dirt roads stretching to the horizon. Wheat fields just starting to green. The sky enormous and cloudless. Margaret stared out the window, trying to comprehend this alien landscape. This was home now. This place she had never seen, this country she had only imagined. The farmhouse appeared exactly as it did in the photographs William had sent. White clapboard, wraparound porch, flowers planted along the front. His mother waited on the porch. Sarah Barker, 60 years old, gray hair pulled back, apron dusted with flour. She had the practical face of a farmer's wife, a woman who had survived drought and depression and war. Margaret's heart pounded as William helped her from the truck. This moment mattered more than any interrogation, any investigation, any bureaucratic hurdle. This was the woman who would decide if she truly belonged. Sarah walked down the porch steps. She studied Margaret with eyes that missed nothing. Then she smiled. "Welcome home." That one word, home. Margaret had not had a home in over a year. She had not felt welcome anywhere since her parents died. "Thank you," she managed. "Thank you for accepting me." Sarah took her hands. "You're William's wife. You're family now. That's the end of it." But it was not the end. Not even close. William's father stood in the doorway. James Barker, 64 years old. A man of few words and strong opinions. He nodded at Margaret. Said, "Ma'am." His handshake was brief, and his eyes were cold. He saw a German woman. Enemy. The people who had killed American boys for 6 years. The people his son had fought against. Acceptance would not come easy from him. The first week was overwhelming. New food, new language patterns, new customs. Oklahoma English bore little resemblance to the military English Margaret had learned. The drawl confused her. Colloquialisms made no sense. She smiled and nodded through conversations she barely understood. Sarah became her teacher. She showed Margaret how to cook Southern food, how to can vegetables, how to speak with an accent that would hide her German origins. She was patient, kind, and practical. "Why are you helping me so much?" Margaret asked one afternoon. "Because you make my son happy, because the war is over, because holding grudges won't bring back the dead." James remained distant, polite but cold. He spoke to Margaret only when necessary. He never looked at her directly. Then came the incident at the feed store. 3 weeks after Margaret arrived, Sarah took her into town for supplies. The store was crowded, farmers buying seed, wives buying groceries, the ordinary commerce of small-town Oklahoma. Margaret approached the counter to pay. The woman behind the register looked at her, then looked away. "I don't serve Nazis," she said loudly. The store went silent. Every head turned. Margaret froze. "I am not a Nazi," she said carefully. "I am Mrs. Barker." "You're German. Same thing." Sarah Barker stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, but carried across the silent store. "This is my daughter-in-law. She is family. You will treat her with respect, or we will take our business elsewhere, permanently." The woman behind the counter said nothing. Sarah took Margaret's arm and led her out. They drove home in silence. Margaret stared out the window, fighting tears. This was America, land of the free, home of the brave, and she was still the enemy. That evening she asked William if he regretted bringing her here. "Never," he said fiercely. "Not for 1 second. Not ever." But the incident at the feed store was not isolated. Neighbors whispered. Some refused to speak to her. The local pastor visited and asked pointed questions about her faith, her politics, her past. Margaret threw herself into becoming American. She studied English for hours daily. She attended church every Sunday. She volunteered for community events. She smiled until her face ached, trying to prove she belonged. Some neighbors warmed to her. Others never did. She learned to tell the difference quickly and avoid the ones who would never accept her. Spring 1946 became summer. Margaret settled into a rhythm. Farm work, housework, language study. Slowly, painfully, she built a life. Then something changed everything. June 1946. Margaret realized she was pregnant. She told William first. His face lit up like sunrise. Then she told Sarah. The older woman hugged her tight. Finally, she told James. William's father listened in silence. His expression did not change. But something shifted behind his eyes. A grandchild was coming. German or not, this was his blood. That evening, James spoke to Margaret for the first time as family. "You'll need to eat more," he said gruffly. "Building a baby takes strength." It was not much, but it was a beginning. But here is what Margaret did not know. Her pregnancy would be difficult. The Oklahoma heat would be brutal. Her body, weakened by months of starvation, would struggle to nurture new life. And in a farmhouse with no telephone 20 miles from the nearest doctor. When the winter ice storm came and the roads became impassable, she would face the most dangerous moment of her life. The baby was coming. The doctor could not reach them. And the only person who could help deliver her child was a woman she had known for 9 months. In Part 3, we will see the birth that nearly killed Margaret Fisher Barker. We will see how one winter storm changed James Barker forever. And we will see the moment a grandfather held his grandson, and finally completely accepted the German woman his son had brought home. The war had made her a refugee. America had made her a wife. Oklahoma was about to make her a mother. And that is when everything changed. February 1947. A winter ice storm descended on Oklahoma with fury that old-timers would remember for decades. Temperature dropped to 12 degrees below zero. Roads became impassable. Power lines snapped. Telephone wires fell. The Barker farm 20 miles from the nearest town became an island of isolation. And Margaret Barker, 8 months pregnant, went into labor 3 weeks early. Let me remind you where we are in this story. In Part 1, you watched Sergeant William Barker give a chocolate bar to a starving German woman in the ruins of Torgau. You watched that simple act of kindness become love. You watched them marry in a bombed church while the world collapsed around them. In Part 2, you watched Margaret survive 9 months of interrogations, suspicion, and brutal German winter. You watched her cross the Atlantic alone. You watched her face hatred in Oklahoma called Nazi by a woman in a feed store. You watched her fight to become American. Now she was pregnant. Now she was in danger. And now everything William had fought for hung in the balance. Here is a statistic that haunted every rural family in 1947. Maternal mortality in remote farming communities was 4 times higher than in cities with hospitals. Women died in childbirth because doctors could not reach them in time. Babies died because complications went untreated. Margaret Barker was about to become one of those statistics. Or so it seemed. The pregnancy had been difficult from the beginning. Margaret's body, weakened by months of starvation in Germany, struggled to nurture new life. She gained weight slowly. Too slowly. The local doctor, a man named Henry Patterson, who drove out from Tulsa once a month, expressed concern at every visit. "She needs more nutrition," he told William privately. "Her body is still recovering from malnutrition. The baby is taking everything she has." William doubled her portions. Sarah prepared special meals. Eggs every morning. Meat at every dinner. Milk 3 times a day. Margaret ate until she felt sick, forcing food down because her child needed it. The morning sickness lasted 5 months instead of 3. The Oklahoma summer heat was brutal. Margaret spent August lying in the farmhouse with wet cloths on her forehead, too exhausted to move. The baby kicked constantly, demanding attention, demanding resources. Her depleted body struggled to provide. September brought relief from the heat, but new worries. Margaret developed swelling in her legs and feet. Dr. Patterson diagnosed preeclampsia, a dangerous condition that could threaten both mother and child. "She needs bed rest," he said. "Complete bed rest until delivery. No stress, no exertion. And if anything changes, if the headaches get worse, if she sees spots, you call me immediately." William installed a telephone in the farmhouse. It cost more than they could afford, but he did it anyway. The nearest hospital was in Tulsa, 40 miles away. If something went wrong, he needed to be able to call for help. October, November, December. Margaret stayed in bed. She read books William brought from town. She wrote letters to friends she had made among the war brides in New York. She knitted baby clothes with yarn Sarah provided. She waited. The due date was February 28, 1947. The ice storm hit on February 7th. It began as rain on February 5th. Cold rain that fell steadily for 18 hours. Then the temperature dropped. The rain froze on contact. Trees became glass sculptures. Power lines became ice-coated ropes that snapped under their own weight. Roads became skating rinks. By February 6th, the Barker farm was cut off. The telephone line went down at 3 a.m. The power followed at dawn. William fired up the wood stove and the kerosene lamps. They had food. They had firewood. They could wait out the storm. Then Margaret's water broke. It was 2 p.m. on February 7th. She was in bed reading when she felt the sudden warmth between her legs. For a moment she did not understand. Then she understood completely. "William," she called. Her voice was calm. "William, the baby is coming." He ran to her room. One look at her face told him everything. He ran to the telephone. Dead. He ran to the window. Ice covered everything. The truck would not make it 50 feet down the road, let alone 40 miles to Tulsa. They were alone. Sarah Barker took charge. She had delivered babies before. Farm women of her generation often had. She had helped neighbors, assisted the doctor, even delivered her own youngest when the doctor arrived too late. She knew what to do. "William, boil water. James, get more firewood. We need this house warm." Margaret's contractions began slowly. One every 15 minutes. Then one every 10. Then one every 5. The pain built like waves crashing through her body, receding, crashing again. Sarah sat beside her, holding her hand, talking her through each contraction. "Breathe, honey. Breathe through it. That's right. You're doing fine." But Sarah's face told a different story. The baby was coming fast. Too fast. And something felt wrong. By 6 p.m., Margaret was in active labor. The contractions came every 2 minutes. She screamed in German words she had not spoken in months, calling for her mother, who could not answer. William stood in the doorway helpless. He had faced German artillery. He had stormed beaches. He had killed men in combat. None of it prepared him for this, for watching the woman he loved suffer while he could do nothing. "Get out," Sarah ordered him. "You're not helping. Go keep the fire going." He went. He stood in the kitchen with his father, stoking the wood stove, listening to Margaret's screams echo through the house. James Barker said nothing. His face was stone. At 8 p.m., Sarah called for William. "Something's wrong," she said quietly. "The baby is turned. It's coming feet first." Breech birth, one of the most dangerous complications. Without a doctor, without surgery, many breech births ended in death. For the baby. Sometimes for the mother. William felt the floor tilt beneath him. "What do we do?" "I'm going to try to turn it. Hold her down." What followed was the worst hour of Margaret's life. Sarah worked with hands that had delivered calves and foals and human babies. Hands that knew the geometry of birth, hands that refused to give up. Margaret screamed until her voice broke. She gripped William's hand so hard, she left bruises that lasted weeks. She prayed in German. She cursed in English. She begged for her mother. At 9:17 p.m., Sarah felt the baby turn. "It's moving," she said. "Push, Margaret. Push now." Margaret pushed with everything she had left. She pushed with the strength of a woman who had survived starvation. With the determination of a woman who had crossed an ocean. With the love of a woman who had already lost everyone and refused to lose this child. At 9:34 p.m., February 7th, 1947, James Friedrich Barker entered the world. He was small, 5 pounds 6 ounces. His cry was weak but persistent. Sarah cleared his airways, wrapped him in a clean blanket, and placed him on Margaret's chest. Margaret looked at her son through tears of exhaustion and joy. He was red and wrinkled and perfect. He was alive. She was alive. Against all odds, they had both survived. William stood beside the bed, staring at the tiny creature that was his son. His hands shook. His eyes were wet. He had seen death for 2 years. Now, he was seeing life. "He's beautiful," he whispered. James Barker appeared in the doorway. He had stayed away during the delivery. He had paced in the kitchen, stoking the fire, waiting for news he feared would be terrible. Now he stood in the doorway, looking at the bed where a German woman held his grandson. Sarah gestured for him to come closer. Come meet your grandchild." James walked slowly to the bedside. He looked down at the baby. Small, helpless, innocent. This was his blood, his legacy, his future. Margaret watched her father-in-law. She had seen his coldness for 9 months, his polite distance, his refusal to accept her. Now she saw something different, something breaking. "May I?" James asked quietly. Margaret nodded. Sarah lifted the baby and placed him in James's arms. The old farmer held his grandson with hands that had worked soil for 50 years. Hands that had survived drought and depression and war. He held the baby like he was holding something precious beyond measure. Tears rolled down James Barker's face. It was the first time William had ever seen his father cry. "He has your eyes," James said to Margaret. His voice cracked. "Blue, like yours." Margaret did not know what to say, so she said the truth. "He has your name." James looked at her. For the first time in 9 months, he truly looked at her. Not at a German woman, not at a former enemy, at his daughter-in-law, at the mother of his grandson, at family. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for my grandson." The ice storm lasted 3 more days. Dr. Patterson finally reached the farm on February 10th. He examined Margaret and the baby, declared them both healthy, and told Sarah she had done remarkable work. "You saved 2 lives," he said. Sarah shrugged. "I did what needed doing." But everyone knew the truth. Without Sarah Barker, Margaret and James Friedrich would have died. The German war bride and her American baby would have been 2 more statistics in the brutal mathematics of rural maternal mortality. The weeks after the birth transformed the Barker household. James became a different man. He visited the nursery every morning before breakfast. He held his grandson while Margaret ate. He told the baby stories about the farm, about Oklahoma, about the family history stretching back 3 generations. He started talking to Margaret. Real conversations, not just polite necessities. He asked about Germany, about her family, about her life before the war. He listened without judgment. He learned. One evening in March, James found Margaret sitting on the porch watching the sunset. The baby was sleeping. William was in the barn. The world was quiet. James sat beside her. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. Margaret looked at him. "I treated you poorly when you arrived. I saw German, not person. I saw enemy, not daughter. I was wrong." "You lost friends in the war," Margaret said. "I understand." "Understanding doesn't make it right. You came here with nothing. You built a life. You gave us a grandson. You deserve better than I gave you." Margaret felt tears threatening. She blinked them back. "My father was a baker," she said. "He taught me that bread rises when you give it time. Some things cannot be rushed." James nodded slowly. "Your father sounds like a wise man." He was. They sat together watching the sun disappear below the horizon. Something had healed between them. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Spring 1947 brought new beginnings. The wheat grew green in the fields. The baby grew stronger every day. Margaret grew into motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything. She joined the church women's group. She volunteered at the school. She baked bread for neighbors using recipes her father had taught her, modified for Oklahoma tastes. Slowly, the community accepted her. Not everyone. Some people never forgave her for being German. Some doors remained closed. But enough doors opened that she built a life worth living. The woman at the feed store eventually apologized. It took 2 years and the intervention of Sarah Barker, but it happened. Margaret accepted the apology graciously. She had learned that holding grudges poisoned the person who held them more than the person who deserved them. 3 more children followed James Friedrich. Elizabeth in 1949, a girl with Margaret's eyes and William's stubbornness. Thomas in 1952, quiet and thoughtful like his grandmother Sarah. Sarah in 1955, named for the woman who had saved Margaret's life during the ice storm. The farmhouse filled with noise and chaos and love. Margaret ran the household with German efficiency and Oklahoma warmth. She learned to make biscuits and gravy. She taught her children German songs. She created something new from the collision of two cultures. William expanded the farm. He bought adjacent land. He invested in new equipment. The post-war economy boomed. Wheat prices rose. The Barkers prospered. James died in 1958. Heart attack like Margaret's father. He went quickly working in the fields he loved. At his funeral, Margaret spoke about the grandfather he had become, about the transformation she had witnessed, about the man who had learned to see past nationality to humanity. Sarah lived until 1962. She spent her final years surrounded by grandchildren who adored her. Margaret was with her when she died, holding the hand of the woman who had saved her life, thanking her for everything. The children grew. James Friedrich became a lawyer, the first Barker to attend college. Elizabeth became a nurse. Thomas took over the farm. Sarah became a teacher, like Margaret had been before the war. Grandchildren came. 12 in total, spread across Oklahoma and Texas and California. The family Margaret and William had built from chocolate and rubble became a small dynasty. But here is what most people never knew. Margaret kept a tin box under her bed for 60 years. Inside were William's letters from 1945. The photographs of Oklahoma he had sent while she waited in Germany. The wrapper from the first chocolate bar he gave her. She never forgot. She never stopped being grateful. She never took for granted the impossible journey that had brought her from starvation to abundance. Every year on April 25th, the anniversary of the day William first gave her chocolate, she would bake bread. The same recipe her father had used in Germany. The same bread from the bakery that no longer existed in the town that had been rebuilt into something unrecognizable. She would bake the bread and remember. Her father. Her mother. Her brother. The cellar where she hid. The rubble where she knelt. The American soldier who knelt beside her and changed everything. William knew about this ritual. He never interrupted it. He understood that some griefs never fully heal, that survival carries its own weight, that Margaret would always be partly the starving woman in the ruins, no matter how many years passed or how many grandchildren filled her house. In 1985, 40 years after the war ended, William suggested something unexpected. We should go back, to Germany, to Torgau. You should see it again. Margaret was 63 years old. She had not returned to Germany since leaving in 1946. She had not wanted to return. Germany was pain and loss and hunger. America was life and family and love. But William was 71. His heart was failing. The doctors said he had 5 years, maybe less. This might be his last chance to give her something she needed. Why? She asked. Because you've never said goodbye. Not really. You left everything behind. You never got to close that chapter. She thought about it for 3 days. Then she agreed. In part 4, we will travel with Margaret and William back to Germany. Back to Torgau. Back to the square where a starving woman knelt in rubble and an American soldier offered her chocolate. We will see what 40 years did to the town. We will meet someone Margaret never expected to see again. And we will witness the final chapter of a love story that began in the ruins of war and ended in the peace of acceptance. The chocolate that saved a life became a marriage. The marriage became a family. The family became a legacy. But every story needs an ending, and this one is almost complete. June 1985, 40 years after the war ended. A Boeing 747 crossed the Atlantic Ocean, carrying 2 elderly passengers back to a past they had tried to forget. William Barker was 71 years old. His heart was failing. Doctors gave him 5 years at best. Margaret Barker was 63. Her hair had turned white. Her hands still trembled sometimes when she remembered hunger. They were going home, not to Oklahoma, to Germany, to Torgau, to the square where everything began. Let me remind you of the journey that brought them here. In part 1, a starving German woman knelt in rubble searching for grain. An American soldier gave her chocolate. That simple act of kindness became love, then marriage, then a promise to bring her to America. In part 2, Margaret survived 9 months of interrogations and suspicion. She crossed the Atlantic alone. She faced hatred in Oklahoma. She fought to become American while never forgetting she was German. In part 3, an ice storm nearly killed her and her unborn son. Sarah Barker delivered the baby. James Barker held his grandson and finally accepted the German woman his son had married. 4 children followed, 12 grandchildren, a legacy built from chocolate and rubble. Now William wanted to give Margaret one final gift: closure. A chance to say goodbye to the ghosts she had carried for 40 years. But here is what neither of them expected. This journey would reveal something that changed how they understood their entire story. The flight landed in West Berlin on June 15, 1985. Germany was still divided. The Berlin Wall still stood. Torgau, sitting near the Elbe River, was behind the Iron Curtain in East Germany. Getting there required special permits, government approval, and official escorts. William had spent 3 months arranging the paperwork. He had written to the State Department, the East German Embassy, former military contacts. He had called in favors from people he had not spoken to in decades. He was determined to make this happen before his heart gave out. The train from West Berlin to East Germany crossed through Checkpoint Charlie. Armed guards checked their documents. Soldiers with dogs walked the platform. The Cold War was very real in 1985. Margaret watched the landscape scroll past the windows. Germany looked nothing like she remembered. The rubble was gone. Cities had been rebuilt. Forests had regrown. 40 years had erased most physical traces of the war. But 40 years had not erased her memories. She remembered the sound of bombs falling, the smell of smoke, the taste of ash, the weight of hunger that pressed on her chest until breathing became difficult. She remembered digging through rubble with bleeding fingers, searching for grain that was not there. William held her hand. He said nothing. He understood that some journeys must be made in silence. They arrived in Torgau on June 16th. The town had been completely rebuilt in Soviet architectural style. Concrete apartment blocks, wide boulevards, statues of workers and soldiers. Nothing remained of the medieval German town Margaret had known. The square where she had knelt in rubble was now a paved plaza with a fountain. The spot where her family's bakery had stood was occupied by a gray government building. There was no marker, no memorial, no indication that the Fisher family had ever existed. Margaret stood in the plaza for a long time. William stood beside her. Their East German escort waited impatiently nearby. "I don't recognize anything," Margaret said finally. "It's like I was never here." "You were here," William said. "I found you here. That's all that matters." They walked through the town. Margaret pointed to where things used to be. The school where she taught. The church where her parents were married. The river path where she walked with her brother Klaus before the war took him. Everything was different. Everything was the same. Then something unexpected happened. An old woman approached them in the plaza. She had been watching from across the street. She walked slowly using a cane, but her eyes were sharp and alert. She spoke in German. "Excuse me, are you Margaret Fisher?" Margaret froze. No one had called her that name in 40 years. She was Margaret Barker now. Margaret Fisher had died in the rubble of her family's bakery. "Who are you?" Margaret asked. "I am Greta Hoffman. You were my teacher in 1944. I was 8 years old. I struggled with reading, and you stayed after school to help me." Margaret stared at the old woman. Somewhere beneath the wrinkles and gray hair, She saw a small girl with braids who had cried because the letters on the page made no sense. "Greta," Margaret whispered. "Little Greta." They embraced in the middle of the plaza. Two old women who had survived the apocalypse finding each other 40 years later in a town that no longer existed. Greta took them to her apartment. She served coffee and cake. She told Margaret what had happened to Torgau after the war. The Soviet occupation had been harsh. Food remained scarce for years. Many people fled to the west before the border closed in 1961. Those who stayed rebuilt slowly, painfully, under the watchful eyes of communist officials. "I thought you were dead," Greta said. "Everyone thought you were dead. Your family's bakery was destroyed. No one saw you after the bombing." "I hid in the cellar," Margaret said. "For days. Then the Americans came." "And one of them married you," Greta said, looking at William. "I heard rumors years later. Some people said it was true. Others said it was impossible." "It was impossible," Margaret said. "But it happened anyway." Greta asked about America, about Margaret's life, about her children and grandchildren. Margaret answered, carefully aware that too much prosperity might seem like boasting to a woman who had lived under communism for 40 years. Then Greta said something that changed everything. "Do you remember Herr Schmidt? The interpreter?" Margaret nodded. Herr Schmidt had facilitated her first real conversations with William. He had witnessed their wedding. He had helped her navigate the American bureaucracy. "He died in 1978, Greta said. "But before he died, he told me something about your wedding." Margaret felt her heart accelerate. "What did he tell you?" Greta was quiet for a moment. "He said that Sergeant Barker came to him the night before the wedding. The sergeant was worried. He wanted to know if you were only marrying him to escape Germany. He wanted to know if you truly loved him." Margaret looked at William. He had never told her this. "What did Herr Schmidt say?" William asked quietly. It was the first time he had spoken since entering the apartment. "He said that he watched you and Margaret together for weeks. He said he had never seen two people communicate so completely without sharing a language. He told the sergeant that some loves do not require words, that yours was one of them." William's eyes were wet. He had carried that doubt for 40 years. The fear that Margaret had married him for survival, not love. He had never voiced it, never let it poison their life together. But it had been there, buried deep. "I married you because I loved you," Margaret said. She took his hand. "Not because I was hungry. Not because I was desperate. I married you because you knelt beside me in the rubble and showed me that kindness still existed." William could not speak. He simply held her hand tighter. They spent 3 days in Torgau. They visited the church where they had married, now a cultural center. They walked along the Elbe, now divided by the Iron Curtain. They said goodbye to Greta with promises to write. On their last day, Margaret asked to visit one more place. The cemetery. Her parents were not buried there. She had buried them in the garden behind the bakery, and that garden no longer existed. But she wanted to stand in a cemetery anyway, to honor the dead, to say the goodbye she had never been able to say. She stood among the gravestones for an hour. William waited by the gate, giving her privacy. When she finally returned, her face was peaceful in a way he had not seen in decades. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I am finished," she said. "I can go home now." They flew back to Oklahoma on June 20th. The farm looked the same as always. The wheat fields stretched to the horizon. The farmhouse stood white against the endless sky. But something had changed. Margaret walked differently, spoke differently. The weight she had carried for 40 years had finally lifted. She had said goodbye. She had closed the chapter. William lived 4 more years. His heart failed slowly, then quickly. He spent his final months on the farm surrounded by children and grandchildren. He told stories about the war, about meeting Margaret, about the chocolate bar that changed everything. He died on October 12, 1989, 3 weeks before the Berlin Wall fell. He never saw Germany reunified. He never saw Torgau become accessible to ordinary travelers. He never saw the world he had helped liberate finally become whole. Margaret was with him at the end. She held his hand as his breathing slowed. She told him she loved him in English and in German. She thanked him for the chocolate. She thanked him for the life. His last words were the same as his first meaningful words to her. "You're mine now," she whispered back. "Always." Margaret lived 16 more years. She died in 2005, age 83, in the same farmhouse where she had raised 4 children. Her family surrounded her bed. The tin box with William's letters sat beside her. Her obituary in the Tulsa newspaper was brief. Margaret Barker, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. Survived by 4 children, 12 grandchildren, 3 great-grandchildren. Services at First Baptist Church. It did not mention Germany. It did not mention the war. It did not mention that she had once weighed 78 pounds and searched for grain in rubble. But her children knew the story. Her grandchildren knew the story. And at her funeral, they told it. The story of a chocolate bar. The story of forbidden love. The story of a wheat farmer from Oklahoma and a schoolteacher from Germany who built a family from the ruins of civilization. There is a lesson in this story. Several lessons, actually. The first lesson is about kindness. William Barker had every reason to hate Germans. He had spent 11 months killing them. He had watched friends die. He had seen the horrors of war up close. But when he saw a starving woman, he did not see an enemy. He saw a human being. He responded with compassion instead of contempt. That single choice created 60 years of family, 4 children, 12 grandchildren, 3 great-grandchildren, and a legacy that continues today. The second lesson is about courage. Not the courage of combat, but the courage of vulnerability. Margaret had every reason to distrust American soldiers. She had been taught they were savages. She had lost everything. She had no reason to believe kindness was genuine, but she took the chocolate. She accepted help. She allowed herself to trust. That single choice saved her life. The third lesson is about persistence. The obstacles between William and Margaret seemed insurmountable. Military regulations, immigration laws, background investigations, cultural prejudice, family resistance. They overcame every obstacle, not through force, but through patience, through determination, through the stubborn refusal to let bureaucracy destroy love. The fourth lesson is about transformation. James Barker started as a skeptical, prejudiced man who saw his daughter-in-law as an enemy. He ended as a devoted grandfather who wept when he held his grandson for the first time. People can change. Prejudice can be overcome. But it requires time, proximity, and shared experience. James changed because Margaret became family, because her child became his grandchild, because love given enough time defeats hatred. And there is one more detail, something most people do not know. In 2010, 5 years after Margaret died, her grandson James Friedrich Barker II visited Germany for the first time. He was 63 years old, the same age his grandmother had been when she returned with William in 1985. He went to Torgau. The town had changed again after reunification. The Soviet architecture was being renovated. New businesses were opening. Germany was healing. He found the plaza where his grandmother had knelt in rubble. He found the spot where the Fisher Bakery had stood. And he found something else. A small memorial plaque installed in 2008 by the Torgau Historical Society. The plaque read, "On this site stood the Fisher Bakery destroyed February 1945. Friedrich Fisher Baker, 1891-1945. Anna Fisher, music teacher, 1894-1945. Klaus Fisher, soldier, 1922-1943. Margaret Fisher, Barker teacher, survived, emigrated to America." Someone had remembered. Someone had cared enough to mark the spot. Someone had made sure the Fisher family was not forgotten. James stood at the plaque for a long time. Then he took a photograph and sent it to his mother Elizabeth in Oklahoma. Elizabeth called her siblings. They called their children. Within hours, the entire Barker family knew. Margaret Fisher had been remembered. Her family had been honored. The bakery was gone, but the memory remained. And that brings us to the end of this story. From a chocolate bar to a 60-year marriage. From starvation to abundance. From enemy to family. From rubble to legacy. William James Barker and Margaret Fisher Barker proved something important. They proved that love is stronger than war, that kindness can defeat cruelty, that two people from opposite sides of the worst conflict in human history can build something beautiful together. Their story is not unique. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers married foreign women during and after World War II. Thousands of those marriages faced the same obstacles, the same prejudice, the same bureaucratic nightmares. But every story is unique to the people who live it. Every chocolate bar matters to the person who receives it. Every act of kindness ripples through time in ways we cannot predict. William could not have known when he knelt in that rubble in May 1945 that he was creating a family that would last generations. Margaret could not have known when she accepted that chocolate that she was taking the first step toward a life beyond her imagination. They simply acted with compassion in a moment that demanded it. Everything else followed. If you know a story like this, a story of love born from war of kindness in darkness of impossible odds, share it in the comments. These stories deserve to be remembered. And if you want to hear more stories of ordinary people who changed history through courage, compassion, and determination, subscribe to this channel. World War II produced thousands of such stories. We have only scratched the surface. Here is the final truth. In May 1945, Margaret Fisher was dying. She weighed 78 pounds. Her family was dead. Her country was destroyed. She had no future. 60 years later, she died surrounded by 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren. She died in a farmhouse in Oklahoma, holding letters from the man who had saved her life. She died knowing she had been loved. That is the power of one chocolate bar. That is the power of one moment of kindness. That is the power of choosing compassion when the world demands hatred. William Barker saw a starving woman and gave her food. Margaret Fisher accepted help from a former enemy. Together they built a life worth remembering. And in the end, that is all any of us can do. See the human being in front of us. Offer what we have. Accept what is offered. Build something worth remembering. Because every love story starts with a single choice. And every choice echoes through generations. "You're mine now," he said. And she was. Forever.